Spotlighting Hawaii's leaders.
We want to bring in Governor David Ige.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Lieutenant Governor, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Mayor Derek Kawakami.
Thank you so much, Senator, for being here.
Spotlighting the issues.
Where is the virus right now in our community?
How much is this overall going to cost the state?
How are you responding to the community's concerns? Talk about the level of citations that you guys are writing.
Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Kalei Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Longstrugs and Beachside Roofing.
Good morning. Thanks so much for tuning in here on this Wednesday, January 19th. I'm Ryan Kalei Suji, joined by Yanji Denise here on Spotlight Hawaii on the platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. This morning, we'll be spotlighting our economy and the impact that COVID-19 has had, as well as projections as we look into this new year.
That's right. It is the start, of course, of the Hawaii State Legislative Session, and we thought it would be perfect timing to talk to UHERO Executive Director, Professor of Economics at UH, and Economist Carl Bonham. Thank you so much for being here today. When we look out at the economy, sort of broad strokes to start us off, how is Hawaii looking right now from your vantage point?
You know, we're doing a lot better than we were 1 year ago. So that's sort of the positive note, but these last two waves of the coronavirus have impacted us pretty significantly in terms of slowing down business activity, slowing down hiring, and really we've seen a complete pause in the job market recovery as measured by the number of jobs since the Delta variant hit, and we saw a pretty sharp drop off in mobility. With the Omicron wave, and of course with Omicron, it's really impacting businesses and households in terms of their ability to go to work. Right, even people who are sort of actively in the labor market and working are dealing with children getting Omicron, themselves getting Omicron, and staffing shortages. So there's a lot of headwinds. Everything from the sort of decline in federal spending from the peaks that we saw early in 2021, and now we're dealing with another wave of the coronavirus. And so, notwithstanding the incredible surge in tax revenues that we've seen coming out of the Council of Revenue's forecast and actual collections, the overall economy is still very challenged.
Let's talk a little bit about the tax projections and the revenue that is coming in and how the legislature will now have to decide of how to use that. We know that Governor David Ige submitted his version of the budget to the legislature last month for them to review. And of course, they will be going through that as the legislature unfolds. The governor wants to put aside $1 billion into the rainy day fund. Lawmakers say they'd like to spend that money more for those working families, as they say, immediately. Your thoughts on those overall projections and how that could impact the state budget moving forward?
Well, so we think about revenue projections jumping, and there was almost $1 billion in revenue increase throughout the end of last fiscal year, and the council just raised its forecast for this fiscal year by close to $1 billion, and so much of that money, I'm guessing, will end up going to restoring cuts that were put in place last session. So there were widespread cuts that unless you've decided that those programs really aren't important, that's sort of one of the first priorities is both dealing with the pandemic, but restoring levels of services. And so that's one of the uses. Building up the rainy day fund makes some sense. I'd like to see it based on an analysis of need. In other words, how big should the rainy day fund be? And it's true that during the Great Recession, multiple years of tax revenue declines were more than $1 billion in revenue below what was expected. But the Great Recession was also very unique, right? A typical recession doesn't lead to $1 billion plus in lost revenues, and so that number may be too high. It would be nice to have it be based on real analysis. Clearly, there are needs amongst the most vulnerable in our society, and doing things to address those needs, whether it's raising the minimum wage, making the earned income tax credit refundable. Those are all important things. And another sort of logical use of the funds, given that there really should be thought of as one-time sort of surprise increases in revenues, it would make sense to allocate some of those to paying down the state's unfunded liabilities. Right. The last report, I don't know if the report for the most recent report has come out in January yet, but the last report showed that the state's retirement benefits, health benefits, we're at about 55% funded, and it would take out until close to 2040 to fully fund. And so it would make some sense to allocate some of these surprise revenues to making a dent in that issue.
Let's talk a little bit about what people are seeing on the ground right now, because I think when we hear that there's $1 billion for lawmakers to argue about, that paints a very rosy picture, the impression being that things are pretty good. And if you look at all the labor shortages, it seems like if you want a job, you can find one. We focused a lot on this program and over the last 2 years of the pandemic, talking about, the really high unemployment rate that Hawaii had at one point. How are we looking in terms of getting jobs and finding good ones right now? What's the unemployment and the labor market look like?
The labor market really is one of the, I guess, if you will, the most confusing or most jumbled piece of the economy. There's so much going on. It's true that Hawaii had an incredibly high unemployment rate and hundreds of thousands of people unemployed. We still have 30 plus thousand. I think we're right at about 38,000 people who are counted as unemployed in the state, despite the reports of being unable to hire. And some of what's going on is the labor force has shrunk by 26,000 people. And so that by itself, when the economy starts to bounce back and certain sectors of the economy that had large job losses, such as in accommodations and food services and retail, they're trying to bring back a large number of workers, but many of those workers may very well have left the state. The population decline from pre-pandemic till now, we estimated about 27,000 people, so larger than the loss in the labor force. And one of the things that's contributing to this is a big increase in retirements. So sort of a back of the envelope estimate is that we probably saw 6,000 or 7,000 retirements over this time period, quite a bit more than what you would expect just from purely demographics. So people are retiring early, people are leaving the state, and so the labor force has shrunk, and that contributes to our unemployment rate coming down. So there's no perfect answer as to exactly what's going on. Businesses are struggling to find workers. That's the same across the entire country. And yet we still have people being counted as unemployed. And so it's something that is going to take 4 or 5 years, I think, to figure out exactly what happened. And in the meantime, the unemployment rate numbers are going to continue to decline, and we're going to get close to what you would call full employment much sooner than anybody really thought.
Another issue, of course, that we have here in the islands is just the overall cost of living. But we are hearing and we're seeing those prices continue to go up. And we're also seeing it on the mainland. Many people are worried about the inflation and the cost of goods and services as they, throughout this pandemic. And as we're seeing right now, what are your thoughts on where we're going at with just the overall cost of goods and services to do business? It's becoming more and more expensive for different retailers and for restaurants to do business here in Hawaii with the rising costs. And how is that going to impact the overall economy here locally and nationally?
So the inflation picture is actually another one of those areas that is directly impacted by the pandemic. Right, the Federal Reserve has poured an enormous amount of stimulus into the national economy with low interest rates and basically creating money. And in any normal time, that would lead to a boost of inflation. And the reason that they did that was expectation of a decline in demand because of job losses and the effects of the pandemic. So this is really all being driven by pandemic. It's policy related. And then you throw into that federal stimulus, which boosted demand, and then supply bottlenecks that came largely because of the pandemic. I mean, a combination of shifting demand and things like port closures and plants being shut down for a month because of outbreaks of COVID. So you can't get a computer chip to build a car, then you don't build the cars. And you don't build the cars, they don't end up in the lots. And next thing you know, you've got new and used car prices that are leading the way for inflation. The good news, the slight good news, is that while the year-over-year inflation numbers that we just got the data for November a week or so ago that showed a year-over-year inflation number nationally at around 7%. In Hawaii, not much behind that, but the month-to-month changes aren't nearly that high, even annualizing them. So in other words, it doesn't appear that inflation is accelerating. And the big increase in inflation actually happened earlier this year, where in March, April, May, we saw big price increases. So there's some reason to hope that we have sort of plateaued, if you will. But it's still going to take several years for this to calm down. And the area where it's going to impact Hawaii residents and Hawaii households most directly is in housing. So housing prices and rents have both gone up in the double-digit range, depending on the neighborhood and the island. And those will have persistent cost of living effects for the next several years. And our inflation numbers will remain elevated. Our forecast is for 4% inflation this year and next. And actually for the whole year for 2021, that's pretty close to what we're likely to see is 4%, despite those recent data points that were much higher.
One of the things that you touched on earlier was the minimum wage increase. Some small business owners who oppose the minimum wage increase said that could lead to more inflation because they're going to either have to pay workers more, lay some off, or drive up prices to accommodate those wage increases. How likely do you think that minimum wage is to pass this session, and what kind of an impact do you think that would have on the economy overall?
Yeah, so I think there's a pretty high likelihood that we will see minimum wage legislation that gets through the legislative process here and is signed by the governor. And part of the reason for that is I actually don't think the impacts will be nearly as large as might be feared. And the primary reason for that is that wages have gone up, right? So, I mean, our minimum wage is at $10.10 an hour, and it's been stuck there for several years. And if you look at the most recent data we have on good quality data we have on wages, tells us that even in areas, so let's say waiters and waitresses, or in the food service areas, dishwashers or counter help, the bottom 10% of the wage distribution in those hourly wage jobs is in almost all cases above $11 or $12 an hour. And so the initial effects of a increase in minimum wages to whatever the ledge decides on are not likely to be nearly as large as people might fear. And then in terms of pass through to inflation, it is true that, I mean, one of the reasons why we tend not to see job losses when you have increases in minimum wage, and this is from national research, is because businesses are able to pass along the costs. And the reason they're able to pass along the costs is because it's not just hitting a single business, it's hitting everyone, right? So all food service, all restaurant, all retail are subject to exactly the same cost effect. But you have to remember that labor that doesn't determine the entire cost of a restaurant meal or buying something in a retail outlet. The labor bill might be 30 to 40% of the total cost. So if you move wages up by 10%, and then you're only talking about a third of that is getting passed through into the price, the effects on inflation tend to be pretty small. and they're small enough, right? So if your plate lunch goes up by 25 cents or 50 cents, you don't change your demand, right? You don't then start, eating at home because that plate lunch went up by 50 cents. In fact, we've already seen these price increases. So that's the other reason, is that wages, because of these labor shortages, wages have probably gone up much more in 2021. And so the minimum will still, again, be catching up, right? And so I don't think it's really going to be a driving force in inflation, or for that matter, even pushback against the changes.
I want to shift gears to talk about one of the largest drivers in our economy, and that's tourism. The impact that we've seen with this pandemic and visitors and travelers not coming to the islands, and then we saw a large surge of them coming during the summer months, and it tapered off somewhat during these winter months as Omicron continued to spread. What have we seen in the past year with the tourism industry, and what are some of the projections moving forward of the type of visitors that are coming, what they're spending? We still have not seen the return of the Japanese tourists, who we know, visitor that we know is usually traditionally the bigger spenders. But what are we seeing and predicting in terms of the tourism's impact on the economy looking forward to this year?
Yeah, that's a multifaceted, good question. And, really what we have seen over the last year was with the various waves of COVID, every one of them have had an impact on whether people are coming to the islands. And that's true with or without policy statements about whether they should come. Certainly during Delta. So we estimated that there was, using seasonally adjusted data, so taking out, at the end of July, August is usually a smaller month in July, and September is much, much lower in October. And when we seasonally adjusted the visitor data, we still found close to a 25% drop in arrivals that we would attribute to Delta, primarily to Delta, and to the governor's statement that you shouldn't come. And with Omicron, we're certainly seeing, we don't have a full month of data yet. It's been, because we don't have all of January yet, and it really didn't hit until late December. We are seeing a pretty serious drop in January numbers, but we don't have that seasonally adjusted yet, so it's kind of hard to tell. One of the things that we know is that the U.S. market seems to be pretty resilient, right? They seem to largely keep coming, but we still, as you mentioned, we're still very much missing the international market. Looking forward, the outlook for tourism in 2022 really depends in many ways on whether we get international visitors back. And that's very important from the spending side. The spending has actually been higher, has grown faster than arrivals. And that partly reflects the much higher room rates that we're seeing across the state, but mostly on the neighbor islands, right? Waikiki, it's really a very different story when you talk about Waikiki versus the neighbor islands, or Oahu versus the neighbor islands, because we don't have those international visitors back. And so if you look at what our last forecast for total visitor arrivals in 2022 was to get to about 8 million visitors. And that assumed that we began to see Japanese visitors coming back late spring, because we don't anticipate that the summer of 2022 is going to look like the summer of 2021, where we set records for the number of U.S. visitors on some islands.
So with that idea being that the people who came in the last summer, they're not necessarily repeat visitors. That was sort of I've got some pandemic saved up cash and I'm going to go on this once in a lifetime vacation. These are not the kind of tourists that we're used to seeing. So if those international visitors don't come back, what is the picture for us?
Well, it's when we do our forecast reports, we're doing scenarios because no one knows what the pandemic's going to bring, right? At this point, we don't know if there's going to be another variant this summer. I mean, if COVID behaves the way it has so far, we should be expecting another variant in, April. And, whether it's more virulent or less virulent, nobody really knows. And so we we're doing scenarios, and you can kind of pick how pessimistic or optimistic you want to be, and the scenarios amount to about $1 billion of visitor spending between our baseline and our low. And so, and in the low, you would probably miss the summer. So the pessimistic scenario would be you might miss the summer of international visitors, and you don't have a repeat in terms of U.S. visitors to the islands. And so that ends up being about $1 billion less in visitor spending, and about a percentage point of unemployment, and 6,000 or 7,000 jobs, and that we don't add back. Right? It's not so much a loss of jobs; it's just stagnation. Instead of, what we really need to see is a more stable, steady recovery where we don't get hit every 3 months by another pause in recovery. And that's what we've seen, is that with each wave, there's a pause. And if we really are past this with Omicron, which we've thought every time, right? After every wave, everybody sort of had a sigh of relief, and we're probably done with this, and it hasn't been true. But if that's the case, then we can get on a stable recovery path that is really a much more optimistic outlook.
There continues to be a lot of talk about diversifying the economy, and that conversation again came up during the pandemic when we saw the reliance illustrated on our tourism industry, and many were saying we're going to redefine the way in which we, help this economy move forward beyond just tourism. That is yet to be seen. Of course, we know that this is something that doesn't happen overnight. It does take time, but one area that seems to be growing pretty rapidly is just the local startups, entrepreneurs, different products that are made based in Hawaii. There seems to be, more accelerated programs and other initiatives to help some of these smaller businesses get off the ground. We know of a number of cohorts and things that have been started. If you can speak to maybe the impact of just the diversification of the economy overall, and how much of an impact some of these smaller businesses are having on the health of the economy overall, and how things may look for these smaller businesses moving forward.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in sort of entrepreneurial activities that's not entirely new, right? I mean, the growth of the accelerators really happened 4 or 5 years ago, and there continue to be new developments in that space, and those are all very, very positive. And there's good research that shows that when you have high quality accelerators like we do in Hawaii, it benefits not just the entrepreneurs who go through their programs, right, and get training and mentoring and help with getting their products to market, but also it helps the broader economy. So businesses that don't go through the program also benefit. And so those are great programs. The other thing is that we have seen some increase, a pretty marked increase in new business formation that really was sort of mid to late 2020, maybe the beginning of 2021, and has slowed down a little bit. That is almost certainly an outcropping of the pandemic, right? You either lose your job in, take your pick of the industries that were hardest hit, retail or food service or whatever. And so in response to that, you start a business. You start making things that you're selling from your home, and maybe you're selling online, or you're delivering food, or so there's a natural and then the other flip side, the other issue there is that people not wanting to be in certain types of work environments and choosing to leave those and start businesses. And this relates to that issue of businesses having a hard time finding workers, right? If we've seen an uptick in people starting businesses, they're no longer making their skills available to employers, and it's impacting that as well. Having said all that, these are small startup type operations that often can lead to fairly rapid growth in activities and sometimes in jobs, but they're still very, very small, right? And so the bulk of jobs are still in the biggest businesses, and so there's an effect, and it's small. And this is part of why diversification is a struggle, and you can't flip a switch and see big changes. Other than having a whole industry or a large company relocate to Hawaii, which of course is in most cases highly unlikely because of all of the barriers that businesses face in Hawaii. So we're working on a research agenda. Stephen Bond Smith, who was a faculty member that we were able to hire right in the middle of a hiring freeze because of the generous support of the community. That's his research agenda: is what should we be doing to diversify Hawaii's economy, to innovate, to make the economy a place where that's more equitable. And so he's working on trying to identify sort of niche areas where Hawaii already has strengths, and yet we're missing something that you would expect to sort of go along with it. So what kinds of small industries might be able to experience a small nudge from policymakers, or maybe they just need a piece of infrastructure to sort of get going. And so we're hoping to be able to contribute in a positive fashion rather than just saying you can't flip a switch. I think most people already recognize that, and the diversification issue is a difficult one, and you just have to try and do it with good analysis and good data, and be wary of sort of chasing opportunities that aren't really real opportunities.
One of the things that this particular administration, when you look at Honolulu Hale, that's very different than the previous administration, is that they have been very reluctant to do shutdowns in a way that Kirk Caldwell's administration was not. They had the tier system, and the lines in the sand were drawn, and you kind of knew where you were going. With Mayor Blangiardi, he says he looks at hospitalizations, and you've seen that he's been very reluctant to do any restriction, and he says that that's really an economic decision, that we financially could not weather another shutdown. What is your thought, not from a public health standpoint, but really from an economic standpoint? We've seen these cases continue to go up, and we are expecting hospital surges to come. A lot of public health officials say it's probably at the end of this month. If that does lead to restrictions and a more severe shutdown, can we weather that kind of a storm?
So that's a great question. Whether or not businesses can. So in the first case, there are big differences between where we are in the world now versus the Caldwell administration. Right? We didn't have the vaccines. We didn't have the knowledge that we have now, and people really have gotten better at living with COVID. We still need to get better given the case counts. Frankly, my guess is that we have seen the peak, and it's really challenging with the way that the case data comes out in Hawaii, where you may remember, I think it was on the 15th, everybody was reporting the record high. It was 5,900 cases. Well, today, if you go look and see what is being reported for the 15th, it's about 4,000 cases. And so what's happening is we're getting suspected cases, which then are being removed in the future. And so my hunch is that we've plateaued, and we will see cases starting to go down. And we're seeing that around the world, where in the UK, cases have come down very, very rapidly. And Hawaii really entered this only a week or so behind the UK. And on the East Coast, we're seeing cases come down. So my guess is that's going to happen. And with some luck, we won't end up with the hospitalization numbers that are really feared. Of course, luck's not a good way to conduct policy, but the shutdowns. You have to remember that economic effects on health are very, very real, right? So I mentioned that we've seen an uptick in unemployment claims, and so for individual households, going through multiple bouts of unemployment and having long spans of unemployment, those have very real health effects on mental health, on alcohol and drug abuse, on long-term employability. And so if we want to think about public health very broadly, then the economy is part of that. And so I think it makes good sense to be very cautious about shutdowns. Having said that, I also think it would be nice to see more stringent vaccine passports. I mean, in my opinion, everybody should have to get a booster in order to. I mean, if you follow the logic for why we did vaccine passports in the first place, which really is to protect workers and employees and customers, and to prevent a shutdown, right? Well, to do that now, you've got to make sure you don't have a crisis in the hospitals. And without the boosters, the 2-dose regimen is, it's just not as effective as it used to be. And so, if you follow exactly the same logic, then all those rules should be boosted. And we're beginning to hear some talk about that, and I understand it's challenging. But remember, the goal there is to keep us functioning and keep the economy going. And it's not it's not just serving businesses; it's serving all of us.
Well, on that note, we will put this to a close. Thank you so much, Carl Bonham from UHERO, for joining us here this morning, providing us an outlook for what the economic future looks like and providing some context into some of our economic questions that we presented this morning. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Great to hear from him on this day as we start the legislative session and lawmakers deciding what to do with the extra tax money that they are debating. We are gearing up for definitely a showdown between the governor's office and legislative leadership when it comes to that $1 billion. You heard there Carl Bonham saying that might be a little bit excessive from the governor's standpoint, that perhaps the rainy day fund does not need that kind of robust cushion, and that there are some immediate needs. And he did mention those unfunded liabilities. That comes up all the time, and that would be perhaps a better use of that money than putting all of it into the rainy day fund.
And we know that is something that the governor has advocated for in the past and has become one of his priorities over his administration. It's not the sexiest item to campaign on. Luckily, he is not campaigning, so he doesn't have to bring that up. But unfunded liabilities has always been something that the governor has, been aware of, and something that he's tried to trickle down. And so there may be some common ground there if there is any room for negotiation. We'll just have to see how things shake out with this legislative session. We also got a better context into these unemployment numbers and what's happening. And, you heard from Carl Bonham of the significant amount of people that have left the islands due to the pandemic. And just by their departure from the islands has also caused employers to not have as big of a field to draw people to come into work. And so he's saying some of those positions and people that have left simply aren't here on island anymore. And that is one of the many factors into why we are seeing this, the numbers that we're seeing with the unemployment, but also this large demand for work.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear about the different sort of forces in the economy right now and all of the different models that they're doing, because there is so much uncertainty. Will there be another variant? Will international visitors be allowed to come back? Those kind of questions really impact the forecasting that they are able to do. But it was great to hear his perspective. And it does sound like wages have gone up because of those high demands on workers. And so it is likely that the minimum wage hike will be passed, and also likely that we won't necessarily feel the impact to start, because he said already that the bottom 10% of minimum wage workers, when you look at what they're being paid, it's actually more than the minimum wage already. So, your plate lunch probably won't increase by that much, perhaps 25 cents or 50 cents. And he said that will not change behavior. So interesting to hear, his thoughts on all of it. We love having him on. And on Friday here, we're going to be talking to Dr. Libby Char, and we know that so many of you have questions for her.
Yeah, of course, the health director will be on the show to talk about what's happening with COVID-19, what we're seeing in the community, the different procedures and process in which the health department is now calculating these numbers. We know that they have been overwhelmed with test results that are coming in, the reporting that they've had to do. We'd like to just get an overall update on how the Department of Health is dealing with that, as well as get an update on what's happening at Red Hill. So a lot to talk to her about. We thank you for being a part of our morning, and we look forward to seeing you right back here on Friday for another episode of Spotlight Hawaii. Until then, take care and aloha.
Aloha.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Longstrugs and Beachside Roofing.